Welcome to Josh's Worst Nightmare Oddcast. I'm your host, Josh Schlossberg, author of Charwood and Maline, surveying the dark landscape of biological horror fiction. This episode, we're being re-haunted by Daniel Braum. I think one of our only, if possibly the only repeat guests. So, yay. Daniel Braum's novella, The Serpent's Shadow, is out now for the first time in print from Cemetery Dance Publications. Braum is the author of the short story collections The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales, The Wish Mechanics, Stories of the Strange and Fantastic, Underworld Dreams, and the chapbook Yeti Tiger Dragon. His fiction has appeared in a range of publications. His most recent story is A Loch Ness Monster Under the Sign of the Southern Cross in the anthology A Darkness Visible. His stories are full of settings that span the globe and explore the tension between the psychological and the supernatural. He is the host of the New York Ghost Story Festival and the Nighttime Logic Reading Series. Find him on his YouTube channel, Daniel Braum, and on social media. Welcome to my nightmare again, Daniel.
Thanks. Happy to be back. Happy to be haunting and to be the return ghost on your show. Thanks a lot, Josh.
Be the haunter, not the haunted. Definitely. Well, on Josh's Worst Nightmare, I invite on horror authors to talk about an aspect of biological horror, more or less, which I define as living creatures' vital processes relevant to their writing. This episode, we're talking about sacred and profane, the relation of the natural world to horror and weird fiction. So let's just start with, what is sacred and what is profane to you, Daniel? What do those mean?
Not to be cheeky, but absolutely nothing. I think I just wanted to come. I wanted to come up with a catchy title for your show. I think the focus is more on. I meant it to illustrate the second half of that title heading, which was the relationship of the natural world between horror and real fiction. What I might have been thinking of was I'd like to review with you or discuss all different approaches horror writers and weird fiction authors take. And maybe what I was thinking was in my novella, The Serpent's Shadow, there is a ritualistic or perhaps even religious aspect to it going on, but not going to fake it and say that I really have something in mind for that.
Understandable. So, not a religious component, but that's certainly where a lot of people will go when they hear sacred and profane, right? Isn't that probably a lot of what would be on people's minds?
Yeah. And I'm wondering what was on my mind, but the religious, at least in organized religion or even in pagan religion, is as far from my mind as possible when, at least this week, in thinking about and just kind of preparing to talk to you about it. Yeah, as far from my mind as can be, those religious aspects. We can cut that out I didn't mean to cut short your question. It's a great question, but
that's fair. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Would you say that a lot of people would attribute, so sacred, good, profane, bad, so that kind of binary that people view the world? I bet you that's not what you're all about.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think I mean, honestly, I just really I liked those words. I may have been thinking about the important to use them, perhaps to use them in terms of like the importance and the respect and desecration of the natural world, which is something which seems to be sort of a vanilla or basic thing in horror. But I was thinking in more in terms of the ununderstandable, the relationship of the natural world to the supernatural, in terms of how so much in this world that may appear as supernatural or maybe something that we humans label as supernatural, in my opinion, and I think what I see in a lot of weird fiction, supernatural fiction, is perhaps a function of the natural world, or of humans, or of animals, or of flora and fauna that we just don't comprehend. We don't have language for, we don't have words for, and we don't have science for. A great example of that would be perhaps one of the oldest weird fictions, or certainly an old weird fiction story in the lineage, um, The Willows. Blackwood's The Willows was an example of that. It, it's neither, and maybe the sacred, it's great that we kind of landed on sacred and profane, because I think Blackwood's approach, and people who take that approach, it's neither sacred nor profane. It kind of is. Both in terms of philosophical looking at it, and also in terms of story structure, which fascinates me too. Taking the first part, the supernatural element that's going on in Blackwood's and Willows, it's neither good nor evil. It's something there. And in terms of structure, our narrator, it's not something that has to be vanquished or defeated. And in terms of story structure, the plot is really travelogue and observational. So even though it's a very old story, it's great. It's a great landmark story in that it's very, very different in terms of fiction, and sort of stands as a good reference point.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And somebody who spends a lot of time in nature, yeah, I think a lot of people do and have attributed certain characteristics to natural landscape. Of course, if you think about early colonial United States in, say, New England, the forests were home to devils, right? That's where the quote savages live. That's where monsters live, all sorts of negative aspects to it, which it's pretty unfair right there.
Yeah, or even giving the fear of the unknown, or they're tagging their religious binary system onto it. Right. I mean, it's understandable. We are humans, and the human mind maybe wants to understand, tries to understand. Yeah, as someone who spends a fair amount of time in nature as well, there are certain things that I observe, or I've observed, and if I didn't see with my own eyes, if you would try to tell me that, I would either be like, right, the same thing would happen to me. I would either not believe it, or ascribe like, wow, you saw, the very least, you saw something unexplainable. And it's easy to see in some cases where a lot of these myths or legends come from. Will-o'-the-wisps, like, there are species of bioluminescence that you've never seen that before, never even thought about it. What are the strange lights in the forests leading the people astray, and on a different continent, I think it was even, well, it's not the 1900s anymore, but I think mountain gorillas were not a fact until they were quote unquote discovered, until I believe around the turn of the last century. So a lot of the things that are simply science, that it's primates, these are real animals, were the things of magic and legends and monsters. So that aspect fascinates me, both in terms of the real world and all the different ways authors like to put it in fiction.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. So can you give any examples of things in nature that you may have experienced in the sacred and profane, and or included in your writing?
Yeah, I'm not so sure how much of the real world stuff intentionally
Sure.
Found its way into my writing. Just a real world example. This summer, for the first time this summer, I saw, unintentionally came across, forgetting the word for them, but I mentioned the will-o'-the-wisps, but they were, I think they're called synchronating fireflies. I grew up on I think you're a West Coaster, or on the East Coast, we have fireflies or lightning bugs, bioluminescent summer bugs. And for whatever reason, I came across a different species of them. They were a different color, a different encounter, and they just behaved so differently. And I'd never, if I hadn't looked it up and didn't see it, what I was seeing was so visually different than anything I'd ever seen before on this earth, that if I hadn't been prepared for it, or if I didn't know about it or read about the science of it, I really would have thought I was, in the presence of something magical or unknown. Um, so, just to, but I'm a believer. I'm a believer in, that we're only on the cutting edge of science. That um, there's so much in the natural world that we're take any modicum of time looking back, we can have it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in my writing, I took in, we mentioned the Serpent's Shadow. I took one of the speculative element, or one of the speculative elements in the Serpent's Shadow is an element of Mayan lore, the Quetzalcoatl. And yeah, there's an explanation. I won't give it away in the book, but there's an explanation in the book. Not necessarily what it is, but different parties, different characters, different factions in the book have their own ideas of what this is, and have their own ideas on how they think, or they might think, to try to use it. So I think that's where maybe going back to the sacred and profane came along. Like, to one side it may have been sacred, and to maybe people on the other side of that, it could have been profane or a desecration. To answer delayed reaction answer to your first question.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really awesome. And yeah, that collection sounds pretty cool. You write a lot about oceans, and we've talked about that before. And I'm thinking of one of the stories. I don't remember which collection it was in. I think it was not your most recent one, which certainly not the Serpent one, but the one before it,
Yeah,
which I think that one was a
Underworld.
reprint though. But
I
yeah,
think it was Underworld Dreams. We were talking when I last appeared on the show. There
that
was a
makes
lot of
sense.
oceans on there. I'm glad you mentioned oceans, because
Yeah,
look, we mentioned Blackwood and the Willows. That was one attempt.
right.
In preparing to talk about different, I'm sorry, one not attempt, one method that weird fiction authors use. Another author who a lot of is often thought of and is science fiction is James Tiptree Jr., the
Mm.
pen name for Alice Sheldon. And they mostly wrote award-winning classic SF, but they have a book. I guess I can hold it up. I don't know where the camera is.
Yeah.
It's called Tales of Quintana Roo. It's from art. It's actually a 3-story little book that came out from Arkham House, reprinting 3 uncollected Tiptree stories that take place in the same area as the
Mm.
Serpent Shadow, the Quintana Roo, the Yucatan. And Tiptree has a very different approach to the unknowable, to the weird in these books, and they do revolve around the ocean. One of the stories is called, I think all of them are ocean stories. One is called "The Boy Who Water Skied to Forever," which is not a funny story despite the kind of comical name. And the other one is called "What Came Ashore at Leros," and the other, I believe, is called "Beyond the Dead Reef." And yeah, to anyone interested in ecological fiction or biological fiction, or just weird fiction, or just fantastically written fiction, track down this out of print book. It's 3 really different approaches to the weird in the natural world,
That sounds cool.
and they're not human centric. It's different. It's different than um, what I was doing in the Serpent Shadow. Maybe a little bit in the Serpent Shadow. We asked the question, okay, yeah, you think you're using this ritual to summon Quetzalcoatl. Yeah, you think you're fighting for Mexico to go this way. You're fighting for Mexico to go that way. But what about the thing? How does this thing or this entity or whatever, like, what does it want? Is it
Mm.
capable of thought? And yeah, and are those thoughts even? I think another it's a great philosophical aspect, and perhaps it's more common in weird fiction, is the notion of the natural world, or often it's the old, you know, world crushing horror
Mhm.
that is it's simply unknowing or uncaring of the human. Which, so it's not an evil. Perhaps it's evil in the way a hurricane is evil. Hurricane isn't out to get you. A hurricane exists. A hurricane is just existing. Like, yeah, don't go standing in it. Don't go standing in an earthquake. But if we're writing stories about hurricanes and earthquakes, it's not like, it's out to get us. And um yeah, I think that's a more common thing that we find in weird fiction is, yeah, like the natural world or the phenomenon so great that human human life can't even be measured against it. That's sort of the epic scale. I'm more interested in um the micro scale, like, like perhaps, and that's what I think what Tiptree does in the story Beyond the Dead Reef. It's like this. I'm not even sure if it's a human encounter, but like it's not. There's some non-human centric encounters, or I'm also really interested in encounters where the stakes that are in play are the stakes of a human life. Like, what is it?
Mhm.
What does it mean? What does it mean for this person to have just encountered this small thing where it's not like um, the fate of the world is going on. So it's a bit of a ramble about some different things, but some things to chew on.
Oh, excellent. That is totally on point. Yeah, I think you're right. Earthquakes, hurricanes, they're not malevolent, right? We ascribe something to that as humans, but it's not there. I've experienced a lot of things where I'll hike around and it's a very beautiful, welcoming landscape. And then something might happen, like, I don't know, all of a sudden the weather turns or I get lost a little bit. And all of a sudden everything does feel very negative, but nothing's actually changed out there. Nature has always been equally as indifferent to me, or one can say even hospitable, in terms of it is providing life, right? Like, here's water, the deer seem to be fine, the birds seem to love it, so it's definitely not out to get us. But I think as humans, we are separate from nature at this point where we can't even really survive out there. And I only go out there with all sorts of fancy gear, so even I'm not experiencing it, just me and nature. But I've felt sometimes that sacred and profane. And I could see, if I lived 100 years ago, or if I was particularly religious, attributing certain aspects to the landscape, which probably aren't there, although I do believe in
Uh,
elves. So,
well, I'm not so sure I believe in elves, or perhaps on the face value. With the exception of the elves, despite that I love Tolkien, I'm really glad what you said right there, because even though we're kind of echoing each other, like, yeah, okay, earthquakes and that stuff aren't malevolent, but I'm glad that you said the landscape sometimes felt hostile, or the landscape sometimes felt welcoming. And you know what? I believe in that, and I believe that there can be a biological explanation for that. Some I've heard people, when I'm out in the wild or I'm out with a guide, and I'll ask people who have really, really gone out there, really gone into primary areas, like tell me your scariest story, tell me a ghost story, and they don't back down. Very recently, someone told me, a ghost story or a supernatural encounter, and I found it more credible because it wasn't like I always like to follow the money or follow who has to gain from telling the story. But this person told me a story about, it's like, listen, man, I know what it feels like to have a bear watch me. I know what it feels like to have this. It's like I went out in this area, and it probably was an area where humans had not been before. And he felt he didn't use the word malevolence, but he felt like a get out
hmm.
vibe. And of course, yeah, the easiest answer is it was his own human interpretation of being fear of the unknown. But now we're in the days where mitochondrial networks, and we know that trees and fungus have communication that is beyond human, or just on the tip of human understanding. Who's to say that it's not part of the natural way of communicating? Like white-tailed deer, there's danger around.
Like we froze up there. Edit here. Write that down. Can you hear me, Dan? Oop, I don't know what
And
happened
who's this?
there. Sorry.
It was a little thick, but I think we're back. So I was
Good.
saying, who's to say that what Josh mentioned as saying, I felt a vibe, I felt a hostile vibe, I felt a welcoming vibe,
Mhm.
can't actually be us humans picking up on some sort of biological process that we're not aware of, we might never be aware of, or we might only be aware of in our future, right? In our future, we might be able to say, oh, wow, if we actually step on a mitochondrial network, it triggers this sort of a wave or this sort of a neutral impulse, and it touches this part of our brain. And until we're able to process that in human ways, it may come across as just being like, wow, I feel welcome. I feel euphoric. I feel afraid, or I feel malevolent. And
Mhm.
I don't know that it maybe it's just a storyteller sense, but it makes a sort of sense to me.
Well, yeah, it is thought that trees do communicate to one another. There's no reason why that communication can't be outside of the tree network, whether it's directed to us on purpose. Maybe the trees are not psyched that we're there. Maybe sometimes they just don't care. I have a hard time believing they're ever going to want us there if they know anything about humans, but maybe sometimes they're cool with that. So yeah, I don't think that's too out of the ordinary, and something that people might attribute to some psychic phenomenon would likely have some sort of scientific basis. Maybe there's some sort of pheromone or chemical being excreted, any number of possibilities. It's funny because I was just talking to a guy, I was walking out in the woods with him, and he's actually a tree. I don't know what his job is. He does cut trees on private property and sort of like a tree repair guy, exactly. And he was telling me about how important all these networks are, of course, and that's why a lot of the logging that's going on around here, even when they're just quote thinning around some trees, he's saying that they're tearing out all of the connections and they grow in these clumps, in these groups, and we're actually making these individual islands, and it's not something that is beneficial to sending nutrients, much less maybe they like hanging out with each other, the trees. I don't know.
Yeah, I like what you said that we as humans like to ascribe like, oh, maybe they like having us here or they don't, or it's probably a lot more along the lines of like not even comprehending us as simply like, it's like, yeah, it's communication, like entity that cuts trees, proximity, or just
Right. Right.
entity in proximity, like I don't know.
Yeah, awareness.
Yeah,
Nature
but I
has a
think
go
yeah,
ahead.
but I think it's the point is though is I think that it is yeah, it's something, and it's something that's unknowable, and it's when it comes to we're telling stories as intentional storytellers. You and I were just telling stories as nature enthusiasts, but then like these are the sort of paths and grounds one takes further and further as storytellers, or perhaps storytellers of the horrific or the uncanny.
Yeah, no, exactly. And there have been
We
a lot
just
of
sort of
stories
threaded
about,
the needle right there.
yeah, no, that's great. There's been a ton of stories. Forests do seem to be the go-to. My guess is because we are descended from a common ape ancestor, and we literally came from the forest, and forest was home for us, but now sometimes it can be sinister to people, but it feels like home to me again as a weirdo. So for weirdos, I think it's home. For normal people, maybe not. I don't know. But it
I
does always come
wonder
back to the forest a lot of
I
times.
wonder. I wonder. I mean, yeah, the forest does feel like home, or I can't imagine the natural world not feeling home
Mhm.
to anyone, even to someone who is not a quote unquote weirdo, or even someone who's been out of it their whole life. Maybe. But that's another topic for another day.
Fair may be the case. Well, something I want to ask you about is how sacred and profane in nature may tie into the folk horror subgenre, which can be defined in lots of different ways. But one of the ways that for sure is it takes place in nature, folk horror, official folk horror, whatever. And there is typically some strange ritualistic happening that, to tie it into this, the people who are doing that ritual tend to think of it as sacred, right? They're killing somebody to bring back the crops, but whoever the outsider is, and in a sense, the reader in the modern day is seeing these sacred behaviors as quite profane, right? You can't just kill people who come into your town and drip their blood on crops. And so what do you think about that? How it ties into folklore?
Yeah, I think it's you hit it right on the head about folk horror. Yeah, often I think you hit like one of the most common, with good reason, and probably one of the most effective plot structures is, yeah, is the natural world, or the element of the natural world, as protector or avenger of the desecrated. Um,
Right.
and I think so much folk horror is either an iteration or a reversal or some sort of permutation of it. In the Serpent Shadow, there's a lot of folklore, not even the Quetzalcoatl. There is the Santa Muerte, which is the patron Saint Death in Mexico. And I alluded to a battle that's going on in that novella, and there are different factions. There's the native the native the native Mayan persons in the story, and then there's the Mexicans, the political designation of Mexicans in the story, and they're fighting. The story takes place in the 80s. They're fighting over the direction of Mexico. They're fighting over what is it going to be. Is it going to be expanded, or is it going to be this natural world or not? And in the middle of that comes the folklore. How are they using ritual? How are they using Quetzalcoatl? There's a murderer out there. The murderer is claiming to be Saint Death. The murderer is claiming to be fighting for one of these sides or the other. I personally like it when tropes and what is the expected are inverted, but just taking it on that first position, yeah, folklore often is the most common that we see is the avenger or the protector of the natural world, and often it's a throwback to old ways. Again, those sort of tropes can be, look, they can be fun and taken in their face. They can also be um, misused. They could also be very tired in certain ways. They could also be used through a lot of lenses that I find tiresome. But at their core, yeah, there's something visceral there, I think.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely an element that sacred and profane. There's a binary to that, of course, right? So here's one side, here's the other. But I think what we've learned so much in life is that is just perception, right? That's just subjectivity. Something that could be seen as good can be bad. A lot of people's heroes are other people's villains. So what do you think about that thing? Obviously, we have to make some distinctions in the world. So I'm not saying everything's but
I think the difficult questions make for interesting conflicts and
yeah.
make the world go round. I tried to capture that in the Serpent Shadow, whereas the same thing that in Tiptree's work, the Quintana Roo, Tiptree wrote about a place, what I saw as a child or as a teenager, what's now the Mayan Riviera, these fancy cities that we can, us working people can't even afford. I saw them being clear cut. I saw the bulldozers. I saw the smoke of this amazing natural wonder. And on the face value, you want to ascribe a binary to that. Like, how bad, how horrifying. Destroying the natural world is bad, right? We want to ascribe that. And I can get down with that. But there's other vectors that come into play. The other thing that's bad that I saw as a kid was I saw poverty and suffering like I've never seen before, that I don't wish on anyone. And when I came back many times. The most recent time that I came back, that poverty and suffering was ameliorated. And so like there's different factors at play of saying like, well, um, maybe there's the loss of this that we ascribe as good, or saying the loss of it is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But now if we put it on the vector of it might mean prosperity for traditional people in that area, well, who's to say maybe we're just looking at the vectors all wrong, or without taking it off right and wrong, we're just looking at the vectors of just like, it's a lenticular, or it's something else. Certainly for me, it was an awareness of saying like, oh, chop down that tree is bad. But what about chopping down that tree um, so people can live, have a chance of, living in dignity and prosperity? That sort of stuff makes
Hmm.
for interesting factors in life and
Hmm.
interesting conflicts and stories.
Yeah, and I think those are worth investigating. I'm on the board of a Nigerian environmental organization that is dealing with people in Nigeria, rural people who are very poor, and they oftentimes will do things like so they'll burn parts of the forest and they'll burn these trees to get the honey out of hives. But what happens is it's sort of like a one shot deal, and then the hives are destroyed, and then it's not so great for them. So but instead of saying, "Oh, what you're doing is wrong and bad," it's like, well, they're impoverished people. It's like they need food. What are they supposed to do? So this organization actually helps set them up with sustainable beekeeping, so they don't have to do those certain things. And of course, it's a little different when, say, it's a multinational conglomerate that's coming in and taking the resources. That's
Yeah,
maybe that's
absolutely.
easier to point fingers or whatever, but a lot of times that's not what's going on. And so there's no sacred or profane going. Maybe the eventual impact on their own land base is profane, but it's a sacred effort to feed themselves and their families and persist in their natural world. So how do you do these things? It's a messy world.
Messy indeed.
It's messy. But one of the other things I think of, so burn forest, so that's something I wrote about in Charwood, and I've spent a lot of time in burn forest. And we like to think, even people who love forests, oh, but it's bad when a forest has wildfire. And it's true, a lot of fires are started by humans, but forests, particularly Western forests, they literally require wildfire. So I've learned to see burned forest with a different eye. And I play with that in Charwood. First, when she sees them, they're these burnt, sinister, creepy, awful,
Mhm.
spooky places. Then over time, oh, okay, this is a natural part of the process.
Right.
It's
It's
actually
part of
recycling. And yeah,
part of the natural cycle, right? When left alone without the human, right? Take the human equation out of it. This
right.
is part. We're nearing that part that humans don't understand. Like, oh, it dawns on humans that yeah, this thing that we're labeling maybe binary, evil, or good in one way is again neither. On a real micro level, again, I was out and there were so many. It was a time of year where the turtles were nesting, and there were all these turtle nests and turtle nest and turtle nest and turtle nest, and so many of them had been disturbed. The mink or the skunk or the raccoon got them, and my friend was quite distressed by that and was
Mhm.
describing binariness to, like, bad rating. And I was like, look, it's we're sad because we want the baby turtle and the cuteness, but this is a sign of abundance. Like, it's a sign of abundance for these other animals. And yeah, that's the way it goes. Maybe like 900 turtles hatch, and it's only supposed to be that 1% going on. So it's like
Right.
you can. I think it's a really powerful shift, a really powerful way of looking at it, where it can be like you can think of what you can take it as tragedy or evil, and be like, no, 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 it's actually a sign that this is healthy, that this is nature working, and don't fuck with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have not that much difficulty doing that in nature. I guess when you bring the human element to it, that's when I end up taking sides, and I usually take
Hmm.
sides against humans.
Of
But
course, yeah,
but
and
that's a limited view as
same
well.
here, same here. And humans, they can't get anything right. Just look at our ecosystem. We're not. I wanted to lay blame on Australia of just introducing rabbits or the cane toads or the snake or the this, and then just their ecosystem is just so fucked. But with the spotted, at least on our coast, it's the summer of the spotted lanternfly, and where global trade is that's just an invasive fly that from overseas that is making its way across New York and is going to threaten crops or the wine industry. And it's like, yeah, we didn't introduce it the way like they introduced the cane toad, but we introduced it by not controlling it and by participating in global trade. And we it's like we're ascribing negativity to it because of course it's negative when looking at it yeah, it's our interest. We want our crops. We want to have our native um, wildlife and flora and fauna, but we're really to blame too. Yeah, we're to blame, and once the genie is out of the bottle,
Right.
how the hell do we fix it? Like, wow, it's hard, you know,
Absolutely. Yeah. And
beyond me.
no, there could be arguments in terms of, say, even invasive species. Oh, that screws up the ecosystem. And I think that's often true. But what happens when, say, this is the local wildlife now? Maybe this is just nature's next process, and we trust nature's process. I see nature as a process, less as these particular species, but at the same time, ecosystems are sensitive. But we can ascribe, okay, the whatever that plant is, that's the sacred good plant. This one is the profane plant. I
Yeah,
think,
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's easy to see that. And I'm about to counter that argument, but at the same time, I also see the logic in that. Yeah, like why, what, um, everything is natural, everything is intended. So yeah, why can't the East Coast now be all Burmese pythons and lionfish and spotted lanternflies, which if left unchecked, this is really happening. But
yeah,
on
yeah.
on the other hand, it's like it's our fault. We had our thumb on the scales. It
Mm-hmm.
was, even though nature knows what it's doing,
Right.
we fucked with its timetable. And maybe by the time the spotted lanternfly or the red ant or the Burmese python or the lionfish got to our waters, there would be a balance. And it's humans that are out of balance with nature's perfection. Even though nature is strong and nature, I think, will overcome in the end. At least I hope it is. But right now it's our fault. We're the ones that are with our thumb on the scale, um and any any attempt by me to put nuance into it, because it is a world of nuance, is still just a storytelling. It's our fault. We fucked it up.
And I agree. And oftentimes our efforts to correct those things sometimes can make the process even worse. And yeah, who knows what to do? But yeah, I think what keeps life going, if there's only 3 invasive species and that takes out the whole web of life, that ain't good. So yeah, I tend to not trust anything humans try to do. Oh, but humans are natural. Well, we're a different kind of natural. Maybe we are, but we're not doing what beavers do. I'll tell you that much.
That's
That's
for
just a
sure.
fact. But on that note, tell us what you might be working on now and remind folks where we can find your awesome work.
Yeah, since we're probably looking at YouTube, my YouTube channel is Daniel Braum. My most recent story does have the natural world in it as well. I may have loved the title, as I often do. The short story is called A Loch Ness Monster Under the Light of the Southern Cross. And yeah, there's a lot of the natural world happening in it. And that's out now. It just came out in an anthology called A Darkness Visible from Ontology Press. And you can find The Serpent's Shadow and my short story, The Night Marchers, over at Cemetery Dance publication, cemeterydance.com, under my name.
Awesome. Well, so glad to have you back. So glad you keep putting out such great fiction, and hope to talk to you again soon in the future.
Great talking to you, Josh. Thank you so much. Great talking to you.
Definitely. Thanks for taking a trip with me through Josh's Worst Nightmare, where I, Josh Schlossberg, survey the dark landscape of biological horror fiction. If you don't want to miss any of the great, and sometimes disturbing, episodes I've got planned for you, be sure to subscribe to Josh's Worst Nightmare on a variety of podcast platforms. You can also sign up for Josh's Worst Nightmare e-newsletter, where I share a whole squirming mess of bio-horror along with my latest dark scribblings at joshsworstnightmare.com. Speaking of which, if you haven't already picked up a copy of Charwood, my eco-folk horror novel from Agata Try It, or Manichaean, my cosmic horror novella from D&T Publishing, you can do so at your local bookstore or order from them through bookshop.org or indiebound.org, or go to Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, or godless.com. Darkest regards, Josh Schlossberg.